Hi everyone, welcome to second panel. We're going to structure things a little differently today. We'll actually first hear from each of the panelists very briefly before we open it up to questions and discussion. Although different, I hope the discussion ends up being just as vibrant as the first panel this morning. So first, today you'll hear, I should say, this is the panel on energy institutions and analysis. So first you'll hear from James Coleman, professor at Southern Methodist University Dedman School of Law, and from Daniel Lyons, professor at Boston College Law School, who will introduce some changes occurring in energy law, drawing themes from the papers that they actually prepared for this panel today. Then we'll hear from Uma Autka, professor at Kansas School of Law, and Ashley Parrish, partner at King and Spalding, who will briefly potentially respond to some of these themes that Daniel and James have brought out, and also expand the discussion to some other themes. At that point, I'll open it up to questions from the audience, and maybe I'll reserve some power for myself to jump in at some point. But yeah, without further ado, James, would you like to get us started?
Absolutely. So this is a paper about the aggressive push that you're seeing from environmental organizations and other policy advocates to assess the upstream and downstream emissions associated with energy transport facilities, principally oil pipelines, coal exports, natural gas exports in the federal approval process, and also to a certain extent in the state approval process. Everyone agrees that when you do an environmental assessment of a transport project, you have to look at the environmental impact of the project itself. So if you're looking at a pipeline, of course you have to look at, are there going to be spills from this pipeline? You have compressor stations that are going to potentially use energy and have emissions from them, et cetera. Everybody agrees those should be assessed. What the controversy is about upstream and downstream emissions. So when you approve an oil pipeline, should you consider all the impact of extracting oil, wherever it's extracted, to go into that pipeline, and all the impact of burning that oil wherever it's consumed? And the position of environmental groups is that that should always be considered every time that you are approving an oil pipeline, every time that you're approving a liquefied natural gas facility, which is designed to cool natural gas so that you can send it overseas on refrigerated ships, or if you're considering a coal export facility, et cetera. Now that's a crucial question for a couple reasons. The first is that there is a boom in energy transport infrastructure that's both a result of changed sources of supply and demand, as well as, to a certain extent, the transition to lower carbon sources of energy. And the paper discusses a lot of the reasons why we're getting that energy transport boom, why there's so much money being invested there currently. But the second reason is because of legal uncertainty. And that legal uncertainty may be, is in some ways epitomized by the fight about Keystone XL, where the president said that the pipeline would only be approved if it would not increase emissions in Canada from oil extraction. So again, it has nothing to do with the pipeline itself. President Obama said, if this is going to increase oil production in Canada, then we don't want the pipeline. There was 7 years of review on this question, including others. That review, at the end of the day, said, actually, the pipeline will, if anything, decrease greenhouse gas emissions because it won't have any impact on oil production in Canada, but nonetheless, the State Department said, recommended denying the project on the basis that it was perceived to increase emissions regardless of whether it did. Now, one way to look at that, and one way that many people looked at it, was as a one-off decision. The federal government typically has only a very limited role in oil pipelines. That's typically just up to the states. And so some people said, well, it's kind of a bizarre decision that's never going to happen again. Well, what we're seeing is that that is not necessarily the case. Both environmental groups took it very seriously, and so now you're seeing this push, not only in the United States, but also in Canada, that all reviews of energy transport infrastructure should include those upstream and downstream emissions. But secondly, it now seems that the administration might be taking it seriously as well. So in the past, at the same time the Keystone XL was happening, domestic oil pipelines were being approved all the time under basically a general permitting structure that didn't really require anything of them. And for natural gas and coal exports, we never considered the downstream emissions, maybe because we liked our natural gas and coal industries. But it appears that at the end of President Obama's second term, the administration is potentially looking to expand the system that was applied to Keystone to these other projects. And we see this in a couple ways. One was finalizing the greenhouse gas guidance that now says it's not crystal clear, as this guidance never is, but it does seem to encourage agencies to do more to consider the upstream and downstream impacts of projects. Secondly, the big development in the past week is that the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was a challenge against it, was rejected by the court here in DC, and immediately upon the rejection, so immediately after winning the case, the federal government said, well, never mind, actually stop building this for a second, because we have to figure out a new process for approving federal pipelines. So that may lead to a completely revolution in how we regulate federal oil pipelines. Typically that's been left to the states. Now it looks like maybe the federal government wants a bigger role. So it's a huge issue for that reason. In this paper that I argue that this considering upstream and downstream emissions for every energy transport project is a bad idea for two reasons. The first one is that it's very difficult to say what the environmental impact upstream and downstream is for any individual project, given that they exist in constantly changing global energy markets. The second is that a legal test which says we will deny a pipeline if we think that doing so will hamstring an industry in a different country is, to say the least, not very diplomatic as a matter of trade negotiations. Not typically, and in sort of in tension with the typical reasons that typical pipeline reviews are based on, well, do we need increased transport for this project? Do we want to enable an industry? Let me right now simply respond to two kind of contrary intuitions that are common in response to this argument. The first is that, well, more information can't be bad. What's the problem with more information? And what I would like to suggest there is that there is some cost-benefit analysis that if you are providing information that's very costly to gain and potentially doesn't tell you anything at the end of the day, at some point that doesn't pass a cost-benefit test. And having done this, I just came out with a paper that was looking at liquefied natural gas exports. Can you assess for a given liquefied natural gas facility where all the natural gas is coming from, where it's going to, and what sources it's replacing? Led an interdisciplinary team that worked on this, and I can tell you that it is very hard to say, and it's very hard for an individual, especially to measure for an individual facility. Secondly, let me stipulate that if your only goal is to stop trade in global energy commodities, sure, this could be potentially beneficial. Anything that slows down the process is potentially beneficial. I acknowledge that. But if you don't think that we should immediately stop all trade in fossil fuels, then I think this is a problem if you're trying to lead to efficient analysis of both environmental consequences and economic effects. And I would also like to suggest that rules that require inefficient and unhelpful upstream and downstream analyses for projects, although they might be developed in the context of oil pipelines, could also be used against electric transmission and potentially natural gas transmission that's necessary for transitioning to a low carbon economy. And so and I think you already see some of the difficulties that the permitting is already a difficult process, which is why, although any economist would tell you that concentrated utility scale solar is a more efficient, cheaper way of expanding renewable power than rooftop solar, because of those permitting costs, because of the difficulty of building energy transport, you are actually seeing a greater growth in the rooftop solar sector.
Daniel, would you like to?
Sure, thanks. So my paper focuses on a trio of Supreme Court cases over the last two terms that I think have quietly shifted the legal paradigm governing energy federalism. So historically, the electricity industry has been marked primarily by a dual federalism scheme, right? The Federal Power Act divides the world into two relatively mutually exclusive spheres of regulatory authority. The states regulate retail and intrastate transactions, and FERC regulates wholesale or interstate transactions. And so, since the Federal Power Act, the number of cases that have come down over the first 40 or 50 years of the Act talk a lot about focusing on bright lines, on field preemption, on the notion that these are two spheres that are completely independent of one another, and ne'er the two shall meet. It's a very formalistic inquiry and eschews the types of case-by-case analysis that a more common law inquiry would suggest. But over the last two Supreme Court terms, there was a trio of cases. One is the One Oak decision, then the EPSA case, and the Hughes decision this year, that seem to signal the court is becoming more tolerant of the idea of concurrent jurisdiction. It's engaged in a more functionalist inquiry and suggesting that it's okay for the federal government to regulate in areas that might have incidental impact upon the state's retained jurisdiction and vice versa. And so if you imagine the dual federalism scheme as being one where the policy universe is a circle that's divided into two hemispheres, right? The law generally has focused on where the hemisphere line has been, but it's recognized the reality there's two distinct hemispheres that make up a whole. Well, I think the current trio suggests that modern energy policy looks more like a Venn diagram, right? There's two overlapping circles, and if you're within the space that's overlapping, it's not necessarily problematic from a statutory perspective. So on the whole, I think this is probably a positive development for electricity federalism. It brings the federalism jurisprudence in line with what's going on in modern electricity markets that are larger and more complex and more dynamic than they were back in the 1930s when the Federal Power Act was first passed. This is in line with broader trends in regulated utilities law generally, which were moving away from disciplining rate-regulated monopolies that were relatively static and unchanging, and unleashing technology and dynamism and competition to make markets more efficient. So the recognition of concurrent jurisdiction, I think, gives policymakers more flexibility that allows the law to respond to this more dynamic marketplace. On the whole, I think that's probably a good thing. My concern is the effect that this has on the enforcement of federalism norms going forward. And so markets are no longer intrastate, and so it makes sense to say states are not the primary actors that they once were in the electricity sphere. But markets also aren't completely national, right? So electricity is different from a market like telecommunications, where unleashing of more competition immediately made a national network where internet and phone service are provided on more or less nationally, and there's not much role for state regulators to play anymore. Today, electricity markets are regional. And so we would benefit, I think, from ongoing engagement of state policymakers when deciding what particular electricity policy should be, for all the reasons that we generally recognize that federalism is a good thing, right? We get diversity, you get experimentation, state policymakers have capacity, et cetera, right? The challenge, I think, that's posed by the shift from dual federalism to concurrent jurisdiction is that courts are no longer the state's ally as they once were in guarding a state sphere and making sure state voices are heard. I think going forward, the line between federal and state jurisdiction is much less likely to be decided in a courtroom, much more likely to be decided in the political arena. So the paper closes with some analysis of the ways in which states can influence energy policy making going forward, and what changes we can make to doctrine in order to make sure that states continue to be heard. For example, enforcing the executive order on federalism against FERC and making sure that they're taking, they're explicitly considering and analyzing the federalism implications of rulemaking proceedings. And thinking about creating some kind of a mechanism by which we would prefer policy to be devolved to bottom-up regional organizations like RTOs that do a very good job of incorporating state policymakers and local policymakers when deciding what the appropriate policy should be.
James and Daniel, thank you so much. They brought up some really important themes in energy law, the decision-making in the energy transport sector, and just the broad role of states versus the federal government. I want to say at this moment that their papers on these topics are available online for those interested. Uma, would you like to offer your thoughts now?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me talking? Okay. Both Professor Lyons and Professor Coleman's papers are, I think, keenly observant of aspects of this transitional moment in energy law and in the energy space more broadly. So in the time I have, at the outset of this conversation, I'd like to frame the issues they've raised in this broadly transitional context, to comment on their topics of focus as well as related dynamics at play in the low carbon shift. Professor Coleman's paper engages a critical transition for environmental law, which is this ongoing effort to update the discourse and practice of environmental law in light of the climate change mitigation imperative. So much of this discourse over the last 8 to 10 years has centered on the fit between climate considerations and the canonical statutory frameworks, with much of the focus on the National Environmental Policy Act, as his paper does, and the Clean Air Act, which I know is the focus of a panel this afternoon. So I think Coleman's paper points to a current and timely inflection in NEPA's modernization. It's defining the scope of climate impacts from major federal actions and questioning whether emissions estimates are helpful to federal decision makers at the project level. So of the states that comprise the environmental law canon, NEPA is the most readily adaptable. Its expansive and inclusive analytical framework is designed to be so. So I agree with Coleman that there are challenges and uncertainties in these emissions projections, but from this point of agreement, let me pivot in a different direction to validate these inquiries despite the uncertainty. So first, looking only to the law, I read the CEQ regulations as calling for just this kind of assessment. And I read the finalized guidance this month on GHGs to reinforce an understanding of indirect effects that includes what we're calling upstream and downstream emissions. Courts have indicated that uncertainty, I'm distinguishing uncertainty from causal scope, that uncertainty about impacts increases the case for pursuing an environmental impact statement. So a comprehensive, honest evaluation, even when that means recognizing there are things that we don't know. So I think the causal relationship and the uncertainty lead to different analyses. So second, I think excluding upstream and downstream emissions from environmental review in a sort of categorical way obscures the reality that pipelines make the use of oil and gas for energy possible. So if it's not in a project's EIS, then where should these emissions be considered? We know emissions from the oil and gas fields are not rigorously assessed at the state level. To analyze at end use is almost surely too late to influence decision-making, certainly for the infrastructure. And NEPA regulations call on agencies to evaluate impacts, quote, early enough so that it can serve practically as an important contribution to the decision-making process and will not be used to rationalize or justify decisions already made. So that's a risk. For example, if FERC punts the emissions question to the DOE when it considers exports. So are these analyses more useful for setting national priorities than for project decisions? I would say yes, and I think we agree on that point. But when that's not happening, that's what NEPA's for. NEPA gives us that informational backstop, so that, the reality is it will rarely stop a pipeline. Okay, FERC approves pipelines. Keystone is a unique situation. It will rarely stop a pipeline to have that information, but it helps us to understand the pipeline as part of something bigger that warrants policy attention, not just a line from A to B. So I look forward to talking about all these NEPA questions more in the conversation to follow. So let me turn the remainder of my time to the themes raised in Professor Lyons' paper. I think that he raises a truly important question when he asks whether the role of states, as it's been defined in the FPA, serves modern public policy aims for the electricity sector. So he explores, I think convincingly, how areas of concurrent jurisdiction create a space for negotiated federalism that offers genuine benefits to the public. So I'd like to raise two complementary points with regard to states' position in energy federalism. The first is to extend his question about the value of states' participation in the concurrent jurisdiction space to states' fixed and unchallenged sphere of influence: retail sales, generation facilities, and for the most part, transmission line siting. So, and the second direction is to expand on his nod to regional governance to consider questions facing states as it becomes harder, as he says, to refute the jurisdictional mismatch between state lines, the grid interconnection, and the regional character of the grid's operation and markets. So considering first traditional state interests, I think Lyons is right when he says Congress defined states' role not necessarily by reference to the functionally ideal model of dual federalism, but out of deference to existing institutions, a path, sort of a path-dependent approach to achieving a comprehensive regime that wouldn't unduly disrupt existing norms and functions at the state level. So thus it's, just as his question is apt in the concurrent jurisdiction analysis, it's timely to consider as well, I think, how traditional state interests fit in the evolving electricity sector and whether, in turn, those interests are still served by longstanding energy federalism norms. And I don't think there's one answer to these questions, but I think that they're really interesting questions to get into at this particular juncture. I think what we're seeing reflects a growing and uneasy recognition that the notion of individual state energy policy is, at least for utility scale energy, electricity, is a notion more than a reality. And that bright line that the courts have cited for so long for jurisdictional purposes was functionally less clear before these recent cases acknowledgement. So as Lyons observes, this recent embrace of concurrent jurisdiction aligns federalism doctrine more closely with the realities of the modern electricity industry, and that's true. So I think one can go further to observe how the FPA's traditional spheres of primacy, by contrast, often do not align neatly with those realities as well. So for example, as states have studied the Clean Power Plan in anticipation of potential compliance, and Hari Osofsky and Hannah Wiseman have written cogently on this topic, it's become clear that regional and multi-state options in the rule are likely to be more effective and beneficial to states than single state strategies. So for, as well for interstate transmission lines, it's been clear for some time that when state utility commissions conceive of public interest parochially, they often do so in ways that suggest artificial segregation of state interests from its region. Clean Line Energy's Grain Belt Express is a perfect example of this in the middle of the country. They have approvals from Kansas, Indiana, Illinois. They're still held up in Missouri, despite that state's public power utilities seeking to buy long-term transmission service from that project to get out-of-state renewable. So in most parts of the country, there really isn't much that's truly intrastate about states' sphere of control. And states have encountered this reality in the face of Dormant Commerce Clause claims, as we saw in Minnesota's defeat in the Heidinger case. So states are in the position of both wanting to defend their sphere of control and take advantage of regional efficiencies and benefits without compromising their sovereignty. And this is an uneasy position. We saw that for Maryland and Hughes, but also in the West and Midwest, where current examples can be seen in connection with proposed expansions of the California ISO and recent expansions of the Southwest Power Pool. So just finish this example briefly and then pass it over to Ashley. The SPP last year expanded northward and now includes parts of 14 states. And this integration of additional transmission is expected to substantially benefit all of the states in the SPP region as a whole. Yet the Kansas Corporation Commission, which has been an existing member for a long time, is challenging the conditions of these new participants' entry with pending litigation in the DC Circuit that's challenging essentially as unfair essentially concession, what it sees as concessions by FERC to these new entrants in terms of the cost allocation for regional transmission facilities. In distinct, but I think still similar ways, the California ISO is working on an expansion to its footprint into other states, looking for clear benefits in the low carbon shift, making it easier to reduce their emissions over time. And the new states, including Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, they're weighing what do they have to gain against what they may have to lose. And a Utah official was quoted in the news citing Hughes as a reason to worry about compromising state authority if it participates in an RTO or an ISO. So that's just an interesting reaction that we're seeing to the Hughes outcome, despite the caveat in Hughes that the opinion was not attempting to preclude state action that didn't affect interstate wholesale rates. So these states objected, Utah and these other states objected to the ISO's first draft governance document because it allowed for California dominance. This is why they began to be concerned about their participation. A revised draft works for more balance, but I think these examples show that states are not just navigating concurrent jurisdiction with the FERC, and they're also charting a transitional course for new as well as continued regional cooperation in power supply, transmission, and markets.
Thank you. Ashley?
So thank you all. Let me do the obligatory. I actually litigated several of these cases, so I should just emphasize these are my comments and obviously not my clients or my firms. One reason to say that is because both of these papers are really excellent and are definitely worth reading, so it'd be easy to sort of add some comments to the pile here talking about some of the great things that they emphasize in the papers. Instead, I sort of feel like my role as the last panelist here is to throw a little kerosene on the conversation and light a fire. So I'm going to try to be a little more provocative in some of my comments. What I'd like to do is sort of really make 3 points, really focusing largely on Daniel's paper and the Supreme Court's recent decisions and the shift to concurrent jurisdiction, and then hopefully pick up on what I take as a few themes from James's paper as well. So starting with the first point, I think Daniel is absolutely correct that there has been what I would consider a fairly radical and massive shift that has occurred in these last 3 decisions that have come out from the Supreme Court. Daniel identifies that exactly correctly, which is a shift from dual federalism, which has existed for quite some time, to this concept of concurrent jurisdiction. Where I disagree with him, if you read his paper and a little of what he said today, it's a more sophisticated type of federalism. It aligns federalism with modern realities. It makes regulation more flexible. I don't see any of that at all. The move to concurrent jurisdiction overall doesn't, in my mind, make any sense. There's a lot of reasons why it has occurred, but as a matter of regulatory policy, I'm very skeptical that it'll have benefits. One of the reasons for that is that, to give you all my priors, is that I'm not so focused on whether or not the states have authority or the federal government has authority. There are good policy arguments in particular areas, but as a general matter, I couldn't care less. What I do want, though, is I would like some form of transparency, regularity, and accountability, which means that you need to be able to find out who is making the policy judgments and figure out exactly how that aligns up with the specific regulators. The problem with concurrent jurisdiction is it doesn't actually give the states any more power. All it does is allows for more regulation in a sort of a one-way ratchet. And when I say more regulation, I couldn't care less whether it's more stringent regulation that we have or more flexible regulation, whether it's more market-based regulation or whether it's more command and control. But at least there should be sort of one entity that makes that decision in any particular context so that we can identify who that entity is and we can hold them accountable if it turns out for bad decision making. If you have concurrent jurisdiction, what you're going to get is more regulation at every level. It doesn't matter whether that's more in the direction of market-based rates or more in the direction of command and control. However it is, it's going to just be more, and it'll make it less accountable, and it will make it harder to predict with any certainty as to what that regulation will be. Now, the question, one of the things that's interesting about this is that there are other areas where you think of like consumer protection, where the argument in favor of the shift, which in most other industries occurred back in the New Deal era, towards concurrent jurisdiction, where you would say, well, the reason is that the federal government is only tinkering around the edges, and therefore what you want is you do want more regulation because you want the regulators to be able to come in and fill in gaps. And Daniel's paper talks about this when he talks about, make sure that nothing is left unattended. I also struggle with that in the energy context as well, which relates to one of my later points. But the thing to realize is that modern energy markets nothing is left unattended. The whole thing is one regulatory construct. Now, there may be issues that are developing here that have not been regulated that some people may think should be regulated. But the Federal Power Act is focused on just and reasonable rates. There's entire energy markets out there that are developed by the federal government and by the states, and it's very hard to see how those things aren't all interdependent in one way. There's no sense in which we can actually talk about a free market in the energy industry. You can talk about more market-based policies that would allow the market to do its thing, but everything is a construct. Everything is developed through the regulation. And so particularly if the Federal Power Act is supposed to be focused on rates, and that's a big asterisk there. When you're talking about rates, the idea of concurrent jurisdiction is particularly problematic. So that's my first view on concurrent jurisdiction. Obviously, there's a lot to be said about that. So then the second thing is, why is this shift? Daniel's paper is just really excellent in laying out what I think is a good part of the story, which is this shift towards more complex markets, more interlapping, a way in which what used to be very localized markets are now much more regional, maybe national as well. I think that part of the story is really important. But the second part of the story, I think, is really picked up on Uma's comments, but I actually think of this as a negative dynamic, which is a lot of this is attempts by regulators at both the state and the federal level to go beyond what their traditional, if you thought of in the terms of the EU, competencies are. So in the area of FERC regulatory policy, it has traditionally been that they've been focused on just and reasonable rates. How do we get these markets to work as good as we could possibly get them, right? If you take a look at the EPSA decision, which I was involved in, that case really shows that what FERC is focused on now has much less to do with that traditional area. So EPSA, for those of you who know about it, talks about demand response. The question in the case was, does the federal government have authority to regulate demand response? And the debate was, well, demand response has a lot to do with the wholesale rates. Now, what is demand response? Well, demand response is paying retail customers to reduce retail sales for the purposes of reducing the overall level of retail consumption. That's what it is. That's how FERC defines it. But it has a huge impact on the wholesale markets because obviously how retail customers work impacts wholesale markets. FERC's justification for demand response is they wanted to align the two markets so that the retail customers responded better to changes in the wholesale markets. Most people didn't object to that. What they did object to was what FERC did, which was the next step, which is it had adopted a payment mechanism after an initial payment mechanism that was designed to align the markets that actually does nothing but what it does is it drives the prices down in the retail market, and it's consistent with EPA's approach to focusing on reducing consumption. There's a real concern in the demand response area as FERC looks beyond its traditional area of expertise, which is how do we develop the markets, that it's taking on these broader political issues, such as how do we deal with questions about carbon shift, how do we deal with climate change, how do we reduce consumption. I am very concerned about that because if I don't like concurrent jurisdiction between the states and the federal government, I'm even more concerned about concurrent jurisdiction between different agencies. I'm fine with EPA regulating the environment as much as they want. I am very concerned when FERC starts to do that in the guise of regulatory policy, especially without an explicit command by Congress. So, the third point that I wanted to make here is if you take a look at the decisions, which is how aggressively dynamic the type of interpretation that is being applied by the court in these cases. Sort of, we talked about Mass v. EPA. Mass v. EPA is a great example of dynamic interpretation. EPSA and Hughes and ONEOK are all very aggressively dynamic. What do I mean by that? They talk about the purposes of the statute. They put far less emphasis on the text. To the extent they're talking about the text is very malleable. So in the case of the EPSA case, it is very hard in my mind to really reconcile EPSA with Hughes. In Hughes, you say the states cannot interfere with the federal government of wholesale rates. But if the dividing line actually existed, then you would say it would also make sense that even though FERC has a lot of authority, the one thing it can't do is pay retail customers to reduce retail sales. That seems like a regulation of retail rates. Instead, what the court does is applies this very sort of dynamic interpretation. So whatever the value of that, what does that do in terms of the institutional? I think the institutional dynamics are really interesting. And here again, I disagree a little bit with Daniel in his paper. What it does is it shifts power away from Congress and it moves power towards the executive branch, right? So in these cases here, the obvious argument is that we could have a good discussion as to whether the state should have more influence, more input, whether the dividing line was really the right line, whether there should be another line. But those are the types of things that traditionally you'd expect Congress to change. But this is now something that is being more pushed in the direction of FERC. The second thing is it makes the actual dividing lines that do exist, the Venn diagram in Daniel's words, completely impossible to figure out. So we've seen this in other industries relating to preemption jurisprudence. Daniel's absolutely right. It is now a Venn diagram. There is overlapping jurisdiction. There are some things that the states clearly cannot do. There's some things the federal government cannot do. And then there's this growing area in between that they both can compete for. I have no idea what that is. I maybe didn't know where the dividing line was before, but at least I was looking for a blurry line and we could fight over what it is. Now it's really quite a mess, which means that the lower courts actually don't know how to police these things, which means that the cases become more politicized. So instead of having these technical arguments over energy law, what you end up having is politicized debates over what are the optics of it and so forth, which is okay if, again, what's happening is we're talking about how to manage the energy markets. And then I'll just finish up with, Uma, your thoughts, which is why I'm very concerned about the idea of thinking about the low carbon shift. Not that this isn't something that needs to be addressed at all. I think this is important. But if you're talking about things like regularity, transparency, and accountability, and you see those as values that are out there, one of the problems that you have with climate change is that it is very politicized. And the more that agencies are explicitly being driven by those policies, the harder it is to know exactly what is driving the policy. Are they trying to get efficient markets? Are they trying to get lower carbon resources? So we see this all the time in these cases where EPA gets involved in an area that FERC was supposed to be involved in. It's very hard to actually understand what the policy judgment is being made because it goes well beyond sort of the initial focus of the agency. And again, I think this one solution to that is to try to better police the lines of jurisdiction so we can at least know who's doing what. And I'm very worried that the shift that the court has sort of unleashed in these latest 3 decisions is going to open an area of uncertainty and be damaging for both environmental and regulatory policy going forward. So there's my match. Hopefully I lit something on fire and I send it back.
Great. So now that we have these fires on stage, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. The panel is now transforming to just a free-wielding, so I don't want anyone looking at me anymore. Just jump in whenever you want to. And audience, please, we look forward. So let the record show I'm not seeing questions at this moment.
May I respond to?
So I was just going to say, I want to give James and Daniel an opportunity to respond.
Absolutely. Well, I'll have more to say because those are incredibly helpful comments. Let me say something that I think ties together something that both Ashley and Professor Oka mentioned, which is if one thing, I think a central irony of the transition to a low carbon economy is that the one thing about our traditional economy based on energy economy based on oil, coal, and local natural gas production is that it was basically driven by fuel costs, right? It was some of the infrastructure was not necessarily that expensive. The low carbon economy based on electrification of infrastructure, solar, wind, nuclear, liquefied natural gas, that is a high capital cost, those are all high capital cost industries. So the principal thing that determines whether you can build something or whether you don't build something is whether you can get somebody to lend money to you for it, which means what you need is certainty. You need long-term certainty that the rules are not going to change in the middle of the game. And I think, I thought what Professor Elka said was in some ways accurate, but revealing. A lot of the reason that you see some of these issues pushed to the NEPA process is because of distrust of the authorities that are responsible for regulating oil production and consumption. People feel that those authorities, whether they're state authorities, authorities in other countries, et cetera, are not doing enough to address climate change. They're not doing enough to address the other impacts of fossil fuel production and consumption. And so, as you said, the NEPA process can be an excellent backstop to say, you know, what's slipping through the cracks. But backstop is in some ways another way of saying, let's relitigate the issue. And that is sometimes, in fairness, what these assessments seem to be about. And so, as a result, that's the kind of thing that creates a lot of uncertainty for industry. I think we're absolutely seeing it with respect to natural gas pipelines, where we thought there was one rule that basically had federal approval of natural gas pipelines, but now we're seeing an attempt to relitigate every interstate natural gas pipeline on a state-by-state basis. You saw that with the denial of the 401 permit to the Constitution pipeline that had been approved that crosses New York. And so I think that there's something troubling about the thought that we should just layer on top of, there's never any cost to layering new processes on top, new jurisdiction and new analyses on top of all the energy infrastructure projects that we need to make a low carbon transition.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think when you're talking about upstream and downstream effects, it makes more sense to answer that regulatory question at the upstream level, like licensing or not, and at the downstream level about whether we need to regulate the markets, have a tax policy or something to discourage its consumption, something like that. I think the question about building the infrastructure, assuming you need a pipeline, or sort of to bring these tools to market, it assumes we already have a policy judgment in place that these are good resources we need to get out of the ground. If they're not, then you need to go back and have that prior discussion in the right forum. I think transmission policy is not a very good place to have that proxy conversation. I wholeheartedly agree.
And this will be, I think, environmental groups have been very smart about applying this to fossil fuel pipelines. But if I want more transmission, I want to support this, this transition to a clean energy economy. But if I was really annoyed that transmission was coming through, Professor Alko was absolutely correct to identify the parochial concerns that often stymie these interstate power lines that you need to support renewable power. But you know what, most of these state regulators haven't fixated on this yet, but I'd say, hey, I want a Keystone review for this power line that's crossing my state. How many birds, if I'm in Arkansas and I'm fighting the clean line power line, I'm going to say, well, how many birds are going to be killed in Oklahoma or Kansas as a result of this power line that you're trying to put across my state? Because they're going to be killed by wind farms there. I don't think the federal government is doing a good enough job of considering those, because they give these Eagle take permits that basically says kill as many endangered species as you want. I'm just kidding. It doesn't say that. Throwing just kerosene, but that's the argument that I would make in those areas. So these tools, why I totally understand the motivation for them in terms of sometimes you disagree with the decision that's made at the upstream or downstream level. I think that they will ultimately be used in a way that creates more uncertainty for all the actors, including the ones that are trying to drive a transition to a low carbon economy.
Can I say a couple of things on that? One is, I think, just stepping back for a minute, big picture NEPA. 1969, right? NEPA first gets put into place. Of course, we have our regulations and the interpretations of the courts since, that time. But the point of this was to graft environmental analysis across the various agencies that don't have environmental concerns as their central guiding principle. The DOT, Department of Transportation, right? They're interested in road building. They weren't informed at that time about what to be considering about where's the road going and what's the effect of the habitat fragmentation and all the rest of it. The idea of NEPA was to bring that education across, and that's true of the agencies that are approving pipelines. We all get expert at what we're doing, and that's one of the reasons that we have this. The pipelines are bringing, not just Keystone, not just any particular one, bringing out a lot of interesting NEPA questions. We've had new segmentation issues about how do you break off the piece of the pipeline that you want to consider in one environmental impact statement. We've had, Atlantic Coast Pipeline on the East Coast here, questions about should this be considered as part of a programmatic EIS along with other East Coast pipelines to determine not only need, but broader environmental impact. And I think that those are all enriched by that, NEPA discussion. And just on the issue of bats and birds and wind, that's happening. It's, I think, in the end, useful to the discussion about how to site wind responsibly. It's useful to the discussion about how to design wind turbines in such a way that it will cause less of that kind of harm. NEPA never requires a substantive decision to choose the least environmentally harmful solution. Many people might wish it did, but it doesn't. And so there is no legal test that comes out of a recognition of upstream and downstream emissions as relevant to the environmental impact. And no one who's promoting wind or solar would say, let's categorically say that the bird deaths because they're standing in our way of getting the wind farm up as quickly as we want to should be treated as not causally, close enough to that it should be not assessed in the NEPA context. They're just not saying that, and I think part of that is a recognition of, even if it's hard to deal with, it is helpful in the big picture.
So we have a question from the audience. First in the back. Yes. Yes, you're right there.
Sorry, yeah, sort of building on the idea of almost a Pandora's box on if you're going to take cumulative GHG analysis seriously, what's to stop an all-out assault on recreation on public lands? Because if you think about a ski area, if you think about a parking lot for a trailhead, if you're modifying that, if somebody wanted to stop those accesses, the analysis of that would be an excellent tool to do it. Any thoughts, sir?
Well, I think anecdotally, NEPA has been used in many instances, right? I remember,
If you want to make your trailhead parking lot a little bit bigger, couldn't somebody say you're not actually doing the analysis well enough for how many more visitors you're going to have there? It just seems like you could stop anything with that sort of analysis.
Well, I think the 2 points there. One is NEPA is not substantive, right? So it's not going to even if you analyze the effects, it doesn't mean you deny the permit as a result. And I think the second answer is that snowmobiling is really, really popular. People love snowmobiling, so I don't think they're going to kill it at any time.
You could do it to bird watchers.
Right. Well, I don't know. So some people I like bird watchers.
Well, I'm just saying it could be a tool to be used to stop pretty much any public access event.
I remember sitting on a Ninth Circuit opinion on this question. It was a NEPA case about the expansion of a ski resort in Oregon a few years ago. And I remember the federal judge in the case, ultimately they granted the appeal, and so the project was delayed. But the third concurring judge was very insistent that we need to put a time limit on this, because the last time we did this, we had people sitting around looking for endangered birds for years on this land to try to stop this from going forward.
Right. So I want to get to Bill's question in a second, but I guess I wanted to add on to that I don't know if taking into account a lot of these impacts necessarily stops anything. I know NEPA focuses on environmental impacts, and again, just as Yuma said, there's no actual substantive provisions. But one way to discuss this just in a broader context, when an agency makes a regulation or any decision is made, I'm a big fan of cost-benefit analysis, and you would sort of compare this against some of the benefits. So maybe now there's a lot of benefit to having some ski resort here or having something else going on, but this could be changed in the future, and these impacts should be taken into account. I mean, that's at least what I'm going to put out there. But I want to get to Bill's question.
Well, actually, I have two questions. I'm just curious what people think of NEPA's CEQ guidance on assessment of greenhouse gases, and whether that will beneficially direct agencies to think more long-term in a balanced way about climate impacts of their choices. And then the second one, maybe relatedly, is people looking at the energy market have said, the big problem of renewable energy often is intermittency, and the solution, the breakthrough solution, will be innovations in energy storage. And so I'm curious, as you all have written about and studied and spoken about energy institutions and analysis and frameworks for innovation and improvement, if you think the current legal frameworks are adequate to incentivize breakthroughs in energy storage, or there's a need for legal reform either at the statutory or regulatory level.
Well, it's hard to say whether the problem with energy storage is that the law isn't there, or the capital's not there, or just we haven't had the big breakthrough yet. I think what Elon Musk has been pointing out is that battery technology is long overdue for the big generation leaping technological breakthrough that we've seen in so many other areas. Right now, I think we're stuck with pumped hydro, right? So we use electricity when it's cheap to pump the water up and then release it when electricity is expensive. Unless and until that breakthrough happens, right? I think it's premature to work it in. I agree with you. Maybe that's like the holy grail solution to the intermittency problem. Until then, though, I think it's really important to not wish away the intermittency issue and realize that you're going to need to continue to rely upon natural gas as a backstop, as a dispatchable resource. And with regard to upstream, downstream analysis, right, when you're talking about siting and building new renewables, the additional carbon footprint of cycling these natural gas lines up and down and up and down and up and down, I think is something that's should appropriately be taken into analysis.
Right. I always tell my students that our best ideas for energy storage are compressed air energy storage, where we blow air into a cave, put a cork on it, and then let it run back through the fan. And our second best idea, again after pumped hydro, is put a bunch of rocks on a railroad car and pull it up a slope and then let it down when you need the electricity. So this is our cutting edge technology in terms of battery storage, in terms of power storage. So if you have a brilliant idea, this is where you're going to make a lot of money going forward. Because I think the Powerwall thing, it's not, it's much worse than those technologies in terms of efficiency, at least so far. So, on the point about the CEQ guidance, I just wanted to say that, although I think Professor Zonka's interpretation that requires upstream and downstream impacts is one interpretation of the guidance that you see. I actually don't think it changes anything. It's pretty consistent with what the case law out there is, which is that you get very, very inconsistent results. What CEQ says is that if it's reasonably close, you should consider it. Now, on the question that, the idea that considering this doesn't really have any negative consequences, I should say that I'm sort of open to it as somebody who's done a lot of these like life cycle analysis of upstream and downstream. If the government wants to keep paying people to do that, I'm not going to say I'm opposed, but I do think there's a potential danger. As Professor Alka indicates, it's absolutely true. Of course, if you're proving wind facilities, you would consider bird deaths, bat deaths, et cetera. But my question is sort of how these can be used for more or less protectionist purposes. As she mentioned, there's the parochial concern. Arkansas has said we don't want this line taking clean energy through our state because we're concerned, because it's not serving our customers. So there's no point in doing that. And the federal government has, through part of EPAC more or less, preempted that. So, but the issue for me is, what if Arkansas gets smart and says, oh no, we don't have these parochial concerns. What we're concerned about now is we're concerned about that wherever this power is coming from, it's really killing too many birds and bats. And that's a question that's subject to a lot of scientific uncertainty, and it makes a great cover for parochialism. Instead of saying, oh, we're worried, you're just not helping the customers in our state, you can say, oh, what we're really concerned about is these environmental consequences that are occurring elsewhere, as upstream or downstream. And it's very easy to demonize those out-of-state wind turbines when there's nobody in the Arkansas state process that's going to represent those interests. And so that's the concern I have, even when the decision is based on it. If it's a purely for information, right? It's not necessarily as big of an issue.
But I want to push back on that a little bit, because with the wind farms especially, because there's a difference. Are you saying wind farms that are already situated somewhere, and then the prevention of an energy transport system
Right.
to get it through? Because those costs and benefits have already been decided. They're already there. I think it's maybe in the, I guess you can expand it to, by creating this transport system, you might encourage future wind farms. But even then, at the siting decision, I think, I don't know, maybe not, but I think we can all agree that the costs and benefits could be taken into account at that point. And those are all direct costs and benefits. There could be a conversation about, well, if you put it here right by this national forest, you might actually kill a lot of endangered species,
Yeah.
but you know what, if we put it over there. And I think these are relevant conversations to have. And I guess I should say this, I come from a perspective as being a big fan of benefit cost analysis.
Right.
So So I guess I'm pushing back because one of your premises is that it's better not to do it.
Yeah, I mean, but so it's
Right.
Spinal Tap, some crimes best left unsolved, right? So actually, here's what I'd say about that. I think we're totally agreeing, because what you're suggesting is that those costs should be taken into account at the place where they occur. And I completely agree with that. You made an excellent argument right now against the consideration of upstream emissions in the Keystone Pipeline, because that's the traditional rule that the State Department had used, was to say, hey, if this is regulated by some other regulator and they're assessing it, we'll leave it to them, right? And that's what was used on all pipelines before Keystone XL. On Keystone XL, we adopted this new rule, which is what I'm arguing against, which says even if this has been approved through cost-benefit analysis, et cetera, at the site, we're going to do a further layer of review on it, right? And so I think the way you articulated that was the point I was trying to make.
Right. But I guess I'm making a distinction between if you were to, because you're focusing on these direct benefits,
Right.
but if you were really to extend your argument to the wind farms, it really would be an argument that would be beneficial to the environmentalists. So you're suggesting it as a potential tool that they could use against such problems, but all the upstream and downstream effects would be positive. So it actually would be an argument.
Well, so why would the upstream, again, remember the concern is not, there's always some balance of positive and negative effects, both upstream and downstream, right? But from the perspective of if I want to block transmission, what I'm going to say is the negative effects are the ones that I want to consider in this process, right? So it's the killing of bats and birds. It's not the benefits downstream in terms of replacing coal power, or economic benefits upstream in terms of revenues from these wind farms, et cetera.
Right, but if you open up the door to environmental assessment that's broad, that can
Right.
include climate impacts as well, not just impacts on
Right.
endangered species or et cetera, then you're looking at a whole package.
Right.
Right, which would include also the benefits of wind farms in replacing some other kind of energy.
Undoubtedly. And that's actually, it's just an expansion that considers both the positive and negative impacts. And you see that in the CEQ guidance. So the final CEQ guidance is the exact same as what we've been doing for a long time. If it's reasonably close, you consider it upstream and downstream. But the one thing they did add is they added a footnote that said, by the way, liquefied natural gas, like if you wanted to look at liquefied natural gas exports, here's how you should look at them. You should compare them. They studied a DOE study which compares it to coal. Liquefied natural gas looks amazing compared to coal, right? And so that is when one of the concerns that I identify in the paper and I sort of elaborate on is that there's a lot of parochial concerns that just by emphasizing the positive things for your exports or the things that you want to export, or the negative things about the things that you don't want to import, it's very easy to manipulate this kind of assessment because it's not something that's within your competency as a regulator to address, and it's much more subject, and it's not something that is the political interests are represented within your process. So it's much easier to take an unbalanced view of that. So in the case of Arkansas, you don't just say, well, maybe there's some benefit for climate change, but that doesn't really help the world. What really hurts me as an Arkansas Public Utility Commissioner is the fact that all these birds and bats are being killed.
Right, and I guess I'll just add, I know Uma wants to jump in too. I guess my concern is that, cost-benefit analysis, there's always an attack against it that, you can manipulate it, you can include different things, but I don't think that's a reason not to do it. I think that just means we need to think about the methodology, we need to address some of these uncertainties, we need to be honest that there are uncertainties, but I don't know if, I'm always wondering what's the alternative, and in your system, I'm not sure if this is where you get to, but is it approve everything and then just figure it out later?
So I'm entirely in favor of CBA, by the way. I'm entirely in favor of CBA for direct impacts. It's just the question is about upstream, downstream.
Yeah, just a quick response is that, I think as you were just getting at a little bit there, Caroline, is the possibility for disingenuous use of the framework is, one, not that common. Yeah, it may be possible, but that's not a reason to discount the framework as a basis which is typically used to actually analyze environmental harms from projects. Secondly, one of the things it can lead to is the identification of mitigation measures. When you know what is going to result from a project, it allows the agency to identify what can we do to reduce that impact, even if we're going to go ahead and approve it. Can it be done in a better way? And so that comes from the analysis. Just to get back real quick to Bill's point, I'm really glad you raised that about the energy storage, because this is a panel about energy institutions and analysis, and energy institutions right now, state and federal, are in large part responding to signals and developments that they haven't necessarily started. And so there are a lot of affects energy storage developments, which, you know, in California, the legislature is trying to respond to changes happening in the market in that regard to facilitate the incorporation of storage into the energy sector there. But I mean, think about corporate entities wanting to buy renewables, right? They're pushing states on this. They're saying, we want to be able to procure renewable energy directly for our corporation because we know we have a lot of energy consumption. And states aren't ready for it. So it's real. There are many ways that energy institutions are in a reactive posture right now that didn't really come out in what we've discussed, but I think is a really interesting part of the transition at this moment.
Let me just add to this as well, because I agree with all that, but I do think that it goes to the question of whether institutions, and you can think about this in NEPA, but you can think of it in a whole lot of other contexts, as to whether the institutions are acting within a bound of sort of reasoned political manipulation, in which case the consideration of more facts or cost-benefit analysis is helpful, and therefore what you're expecting is reasoned decision makers to take into a bunch of considerations and come up with what the right policy judgment. What concerns me, and I think this goes to Bill's question about incentives for innovation, is that, and Uma is exactly right, that the industry right now is in a huge state of flux. Now, some people would say that that uncertainty that is occurring out there is good because people are investing in new areas. What I'm concerned about, though, is that this uncertainty is actually also driven by a lot of politics that are infiltrating from all areas. And I think where I take James' point to be a valid one, it's not a question necessarily I don't know enough about the particular case as to how much you think about cost benefits or how you do it, but that if the system is completely up for grabs and what you feel is that there are parochial interests that are driving everything, then you're not going to get anything approaching sensible results. And there's a pretty interesting debate as to whether we are getting sensible results or whether some of these things are getting spun out of control. My sense, if you take a look at the industry right now, is that there is so much uncertainty as to what types of innovations are going to work, that there is a lot of money that's on the table, there's a lot of investment, but there's a lot of regulation that is being counterproductive, in part just because nobody knows which way we're moving. The move towards a low carbon focus is fraught with not only sort of policy but also with politics, and it makes it just very challenging.
Yeah, correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, James, but my understanding is your argument isn't that we shouldn't be asking what are upstream, what's the effect of increasing oil production, what's the effect of increasing oil consumption, but who should be asking that question at what point, right? Resting power to consider these questions in the hands of middlemen who are not competent necessarily to experts on that area can lead to mischievousness. I remember we're litigating the citation of an energy transmission line from Arizona to California to try to get some of the Arizona solar power to come fill California's RPS requirements. The Arizona Corporation Commission rejected the line for a bunch of ticky-tack reasons, and then they went outside and gave a press conference. And ultimately they said, the reason we denied this is because we don't want to be a giant extension cord to California. Right? We want our energy to stay in the state. Now,
That's not a NEPA analysis.
No, it's not. But it's a question about the ways in which politics can influence. So they had a number of different levers they could pull on to block the line, and they pulled on the levers that they needed to and said what they needed to do to accomplish their political end. On that point, and to take advantage of the chance to put out one of your fires, I agree with you that oftentimes, particularly under the Federal Power Act, FERC is using its jurisdiction to accomplish policy goals that are beyond its core competency. Right? The Federal Power Act was written initially to regulate monopolies, to make sure that you're not engaging in nefarious economic issues. And so to then push forward a demand response if the goal is not just balancing wholesale market rates, but actually discouraging consumption, that is potentially a problem because it's not what the statute was designed to do. But I don't think that's an issue with concurrent jurisdiction as much as it is an issue with Chevron, right? The notion that FERC just has the authority to go back and interpret these open-ended phrases really broadly, particularly after City of Arlington. They can interpret even their jurisdictional grants really broadly.
Well, so I think that's right, but the problem with the concurrent jurisdiction is, so let's say you either think FERC should or should not be doing it. If all FERC is doing is regulating markets and rates, then you have sort of the Hughes problem, right? Which is that the state comes in and says, I really don't like the way that the wholesale markets are set up. I prefer my in-state interest to be treated differently, and so I'm going to try to regulate it. And then the Supreme Court strikes it down and says, no, you can't do that. The FERC gets to decide. FERC's responsible for that, and if there's too many states that are upset, that goes. The problem is that the more that FERC then becomes a consumption agency or starts looking at environmental issues, you see that there's now going to be more conflicts and confusion because the state's interests in regulating consumption are really, much more significant than the types of rates. So the way I think about it is you have to say, look, you let EPA regulate the environment, you let those chips fall as where they may, and then you let FERC regulate the energy markets. If you allow FERC to regulate the environment as well, then what you're going to have is you're going to have the states making a counter move. And all that counter move will do is sort of add the complexity, and the regulatory burdens unrelated to the stringency of the regulation will become greater because there will just be more, rent seeking and counter moving at the different levels. And so my thought is that particularly with energy markets, you want to reduce that as much as possible.
So the flip side of that, though, is the regulatory gap problem, right? And I don't mean regulatory gap in the sense of the way the Attleboro Court was, right? Oh, the sky is falling, there's no government regulation. Well, there's no government regulator necessarily in a lot of areas of the free market economy. That's not a problem per se, right? The problem is when, and the sense that what we call deregulation was actually a shift toward managed competition. I agree with you that we're not really in a free market in any sense of the word. But the idea is that if you have a good idea and you can't figure out how to source it. So I think you go back and take EPSA, for example, right? I think everybody agreed that wholesale demand response was a good idea. Even the FERC dissent said, this is good policy, it just I don't know that we have the power to do it. But if you don't allow it to happen, then you end up with a regulatory void where nobody can set it up. The problem was pricing in order to accomplish some policy goal. That's an argument you can have at the rulemaking proceeding at FERC, right?
You see, so I disagree with that. And the reason I disagree with it is that I think inevitably the gap argument will always be a first move or second move argument. And that if you police the lines as best as you can, they will figure out a way to get around the gap. So there's a lot of reasons in EPSA, for example, where FERC could have achieved its policy goals in a way that would have worked with the states. Another thing actually is that nobody probably would have challenged their demand response if all they had done was do what they were trying to do, which was balance the markets by creating incentives for the retail customers to respond. When the litigation actually took off was when they suddenly decided we're going to pursue this other goal and we're going to push consumption down. And that's when everyone went crazy because it really impacted the market.
Right, but then the litigation wasn't about that, though, right? It wound up.
Oh, it was, yeah.
Well, I mean, in the sense of I
yeah.
understand the arbitrary and capriciousness challenge was really that strikes me as the crux of the issue and where the court should have been focusing rather than on this jurisdictional line. The question was the pricing that FERC did arbitrary and capricious or not?
No, so I agree with that, but you see, I just think that I put a lot of premium on getting the institutional structures right, and in order to do that, you have to put up a lot of blocks and checks in order to make sure that the agencies sort of now, as you can tell from my comments, part of that is that I want to have more pressure back on Congress to do what it needs to do, as opposed to what I think is right now, which is a drain of power from Congress. Everyone says Congress is dysfunctional, but that's because the courts allow Congress to do absolutely nothing.
100% agree with you there.
So, if you're going to think of it as blocking and checking, the advantage of some, dual federalism is that it's never going to be perfect. No system's going to be perfect, but you are trying to block the pathologies of politicized agency decision making, and I just worry that concurrent jurisdiction allows those pathologies to flourish.
I want to go back to a point previously with James's paper, if that's okay. But I encourage questions from the audience. I'm looking out, so please feel free to jump in. Actually.
I have a question. Hi, Mike Petrino, Kirkland & Ellis. This is a question for Professor Lyons. I liked your back and forth with Ashley there. That was very informative. Thank you. I'll do something I don't always do, and that's confess I don't have knowledge of this substantive area, but I'm interested and whether you have response to Ashley's point on concurrent jurisdiction versus one problem, one sovereign. I agree with Ashley on that as a general matter in other areas. But since I don't have substantive knowledge here, do you see any benefits in this specific area to concurrent jurisdiction. I'm not inclined to ever see any benefits to concurrent jurisdiction, but what's your response
No,
to
there are.
that?
So demand response is actually a pretty good example of that, right? The fact that the states were experimenting with demand response at the retail level made it clear, allowed FERC to be more comfortable. FERC was not initially inclined to go forward with demand response at all because they weren't sure whether it was going to work or not. It was allowing the issue to percolate at the state level that allowed them to be more comfortable with it. So one of the benefits of concurrent jurisdiction is when one of the two levels of government is not willing to step in yet, the other one can step in and at least try policy initiatives to see what works and what doesn't. And so you end up with these sort of benefits that we generally see from federalism, experimentation at the state level that can then inform a broader federal goal.
Can I throw more fire?
Sure.
So that's wrong, and the reason it's wrong is because the reason it's wrong is that it puts a huge premium on regulation for the sake of regulation. And so if you take a look at demand response is a good example, which is that the reason the states were able to experiment was because they were acting within their sphere. There was a congressional statute that specifically said, we think this is important, so we're going to give states more role. It didn't blur the lines of jurisdiction, but Congress had acted there. The idea of states as laboratories of experimentation, that's, a Justice Brandeis opinion, it comes out of the New Deal. It almost always, in my personal view, cuts the wrong way. It doesn't allow for experimentation in terms of in productive ways. What it tends to do is allow for experimentation in terms of rent seeking. So, I have no problem with the demand response. That would have existed anyway. What I'm concerned about is that going forward, the types of experimentation you're seeing are going to be more like the Hughes thing, right? Which is that Hughes was so clearly an attempt to say, boy, we're really ticked off with what the FERC has done here. We've got to do something. And and again, it's not that I don't agree that there's some experimentation, but that argument is always used as an argument for concurrent jurisdiction. And I just don't think over time it actually holds up.
So I get the one-way ratchet argument with regard to the drift toward the federal government over time, but I think it does lead. So One Oak is a good example, right? In One Oak, the states were, at least state law was allowing the pursuit of these antitrust claims against the energy traders that in a dual federalism world would have been foreclosed by field preemption, right? This is an area that is under FERC's jurisdiction and state law would have been preempted. But FERC wasn't acting and didn't act on a code of conduct until after these cases had been filed at the state level. And that pressured FERC into saying, hey, maybe Enron faking a bunch of energy transactions was a bad idea and we should probably adopt a code of conduct that says don't do that anymore.
Well, so I think One Oak is much more challenging, and I think what's terrible about the decision, it's so confusing to understand what the court is actually saying. I mean, if you talk about people on either side of the One Oak issue, everybody has a different view as to whether One Oak was correctly decided or wrongly decided. Everyone agrees that they have no clue what the decision is saying. And part of that is that I think there's an argument there that the states actually did have jurisdiction and that this was not intruding on FERC. So I'm not saying that you get rid of questions about preemption at all. On the other hand, though, the California energy crisis is a great example of this. I mean, there's a huge debate as to whether it was Enron that caused the energy crisis or whether it was, just terrible energy policy out of California that forced FERC to come in. I mean, if you take a look at the model of California regulation right now, the general policy is this: is that we have regulated at such a level that none of it makes any sense anymore. So we're going to do two things. We are going to export our policies as much as possible, which is why almost every energy case or other regulatory problem in California now has a dormant commerce clause component. Usually it loses, but almost always there's a question as to the external effects. And then the second thing is California is experimenting with the fact that they need to create lots of exemptions from their policies because they realize that industries are going under. So if you're an industry in California, you go to the regulators and you say, look, my industry is about to collapse, we need some form of relief. The regulator will then give you the relief and everybody else will be held at the same level until they need more relief. So there's a lot of, interesting debates there, but I'm not sure whether concurrent jurisdiction helps, and I think the California model of extraterritoriality shows why you need to be particularly concerned about how that works.
All right, we are on 10:58. We have 2 minutes, 2-minute warning if someone wants to jump into the conversation. All right. So I'll jump in with a question. I was going to ask James a question, but I think I might save that for later. And Daniel, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about I like your framework about the negotiation, changing, that this is now changed to a negotiation process. And, you know, I'm thinking back to a comment that I think it was Patrick Wyrick made. He's the Solicitor General of Oklahoma on the first panel, and that was in a different context, in a standing context. But talking about the only option that states sometimes have is litigation. But you mentioned a few other options in the energy context, and I was wondering if you can talk about what you think is the most important one, I guess,
well,
going forward.
Litigation remains a very useful tool, right? If you think about the Venn diagram, right, where litigation becomes an important tool for states to continue to guard that line that keeps their crescent protected. But there's a lot of other levers that states can pull on to try to negotiate the right jurisdictional line, right? One is exercise an independent authority in order to try to put pressure on the federal sovereign. That's what arguably was going on in One Oak. They can lobby, participate in FERC rulemaking proceedings, and oftentimes states have special access in a way that you and I certainly wouldn't, above and beyond the typical participatory rights that we get at the APA. States are also very good at lobbying, right? So we talk about the standard market design proposal that FERC was trying to impose upon the states in the mid-2000s. One of the big things that the states were able to do was go over FERC's head, right, to raise the issue in Congress and try to get some language into the 2005 Energy Policy Act that would have eliminated it. Now, although they weren't successful in getting legislation they wanted, the fact that they raised it to Congress's attention put pressure on FERC, and FERC backed off voluntarily, or kicking and screaming the whole way, but ultimately gave it up. So there's a lot of different tools that states have to participate as political actors in conversation with the feds. Part of my concern was trying to figure out how do we make sure that when they're speaking, the feds are listening. And so part of the answer, I think, is making sure that when FERC is acting, they're explicitly taking federalism issues into account, the way that the executive order for non-independent agencies is supposed to guide executive branch policymaking. And I think another is making sure that questions are being decided in these regional structures, like relying upon them as more cooperative federalism regimes. I think it's problematic to think of the world as either federal or state. I think the vast majority of energy policy questions require both federal and state input, and providing forums for that dialogue to occur is a good thing.
All right, thank you to the panelists.